I think 2020 and now into 2021 is seeing great investment around building sort of digital communities around your sports property and how you do that in an effective way and how you want to really rethink what the broadcast experience looks like and maybe make it a little less one-to-many and a little more one-to-one, a little more personalized. And I think we're finally seeing big media companies, big sports properties leaning in on that.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the section where we highlight what we think are some of the best venture investors in the media industry globally. And I'm super excited to be with Jasmine. Jasmine is the principal at Causeway Media Partners. Jasmine, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to be speaking with you.
To give context to why we're having this conversation, we looked at well over 60 venture firms that we think are actively investing within the media industry. And Causeway Media Partners, I wouldn't say you are exclusively a media investor, but you have a lot of overlap into some startups in the media industry that are really impressive. And you have a fantastic portfolio, but I think you have a unique investment thesis overall. And even at a broader level, I think that the ways in which you support your portfolio is very unique and impressive as well. So we're going to jump into that. But before we do, Jasmine, maybe you could give a background of who is Causeway Media Partners.
Yeah, absolutely. So Causeway was really born out of the sports ecosystem. So we founded the fund coming from positions of team ownerships from some professional teams like the Boston Celtics and San Francisco 49ers. And we're really watching the way that the sort of media and consumer trends around the sports and entertainment ecosystem were changing quite rapidly, and felt like there weren't that many investors who were really focused right at this intersection of sports and media, and created the fund with that thesis. A little different than other VC funds, all of our capital comes from individuals, so no institutional investors, and all individuals who are really strategic within these verticals where we invest. So it's folks like team owners from all of the major leagues in the US and a number outside of the US, and then senior executives across the media, sports, and gaming landscape. So it's really a great group of people who can be value-added support for the companies that we back. We really spend our time investing in four main verticals. So the first is anything in and around sports. The second is the health, wellness, and fitness space. The third is anything across media and content. And then finally, gaming and esports. So those are really the big areas where we spend our time. We have a $200 million fund that we're investing out of now, which is our second fund, and really like to back kind of growth stage companies. So companies that are established and have strong monetization track records and are looking for additional capital to accelerate their growth. And so love backing great teams in these spaces.
It's really interesting, not only the structure that you've set up, but also the approach and the verticals that you're after. And I think I highly encourage, we'll get into it a little bit later on your portfolio, but I highly encourage the audience to look at your portfolio with some fantastic companies. I wanted to quickly just dive into your investment thesis because you have a really big focus on the sport ecosystem. And I'm just curious, what was the rationale for it? I know you mentioned in the beginning that maybe it felt like a gap in the investor ecosystem focused on that category, but just maybe you could expand upon that more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think all of us on the team at Causeway come from a sort of deep background in the sports ecosystem. I think we like to invest in places where we feel like we are deep experts and have strong knowledge of the market, and certainly saw alignment there. But beyond that, I think as we thought about where sports was in 2013 when we founded the fund and where we felt like it was going to evolve, and I think this has largely played out over the past 8 or so years here, is that we felt like we saw the sort of rigor of innovation around sports really accelerating really across all of the verticals. So whether that's everything from the training and nutrition and all the things that go on to put a good product on the field, through to the way content is delivered to fans, the way we can engage with sports fans these days. It really just felt like there were big advances happening in those spaces, and yeah, found there could be great alignment to bring the deep networks that we have in the sports ecosystem to help early stage companies who might not necessarily have all of the deep relationships in those spaces. And so bringing that strategic value and network is really important to us.
What I think is impressive about your fund and your portfolio and your guys' approach is you really truly go after that end-to-end ecosystem of sports. You're in content, you're in platforms, you're in sports teams, you're even in specific products and brands. But I'm just curious, do you guys like to focus on more on the specific brands or the content or even actual teams, or do you tend to lean more towards platform solutions instead? Or is it just a mix of both and it really depends on the value?
Yeah, I think it's generally a mix of both. I think what we're really optimizing for is just backing excellent teams who we feel like are building great products, whether that's consumer products or more B2B platforms. I do think that our portfolio skews a bit more towards the consumer side. I think we really just as a team love that sort of consumer side of the ecosystem. And so, on balance, have made some more investments there. But really, at the end of the day, we're trying to think about where is the sports ecosystem going in the next 5 or 10 years, and what are the companies and teams that are building great products against those themes. And beyond that, that's really the focus rather than anything more specific around platforms or consumer products.
And I think your portfolio represents that really well. And you have fantastic teams in your portfolio for all the companies that you've invested in. But I want to go back even on what you mentioned before. You guys are a later stage or growth stage focus. And I'm just curious, betting on the later stages of companies in this category, generally media or sports or the verticals that you're in, what aspects or phases of the company is kind of your sweet spot for your fund to be like, that's right for our fund and we want to participate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think definitely a company that has an established product, has really figured out what business model works for that product, and has started proving out what are the real metrics associated with growth. I think given the sort of size of checks that we typically write, which on average is in the $10 to $15 million range, we like to feel really confident that as you go and spend dollars on things like building out a team, accelerating the product, increasing spend on marketing, that you really know the pathway to get there and have some of the early data for how that's going to play out. One kind of rule of thumb that we tend to use a lot on the lower end of figuring out if a company really meets that threshold is thinking about sort of 5 million in annualized revenue is usually a good sort of on the very small end, what's the earliest we get involved. But then in terms of stage beyond that, we really look at rounds all the way through pre-IPO rounds. So really more flexible on stage on the upper side than on the lower.
I suppose we'll get into it a little bit earlier or later, but given that coming in at the later stages, it really allows you to leverage your network that you've built within the ecosystems to actually provide a lot of value and kind of accelerate that growth at those later stages as well. I wanted to shift gears now from the investment thesis and focus on the portfolio. I know there's some recent investments that maybe you've made, whether it's Zwift or Freeletics, but I'm just curious, can you share more details about a recent investment that you've made or a portfolio company you're currently excited about?
Yeah, absolutely. One that comes to mind that we backed relatively recently is a company called Tracksmith, which is in the running apparel space. They really found a white space in the market around really super serving the competitive and serious runner in a way that maybe Nike did in its early days and has gotten away from a little bit as it becomes this generalist, excellent consumer brand. But really, I think Matt and the team at Tracksmith saw that they, as serious runners, weren't really being served by that Nike brand anymore and felt like they wanted a brand that really spoke to them both in terms of products that are right for competitive runners, as well as a brand ethos that really aligned with that lifestyle that goes along with it. I think there we were really just excited about the kind of deep community that they had built with the brand. So we have deep roots across and presence across all of the major marathons each year, a really tight knit community in the Boston and New York areas where they've really gotten started, and increasingly seeing that demand start to ramp up really globally for the brands. They've been doing great and certainly are benefiting from the trends around people getting more active and getting outside and running during the pandemic when there's not as many other options for staying active and fit.
It's interesting to see how you can, especially having the knowledge of your team being really active in that sports community, as well as understanding products that would probably serve that industry really well, and really jumping in at products that you think have a lot of potential, especially in companies like that you just mentioned that have a kind of niche focus, but a lot of potential long-term, and doubling down on those opportunities. I think it's fantastic. And I think it does take a lot of talent. Shifting gears to general questions about just the industry of sports and your thoughts overall. It seems like the consumption of sports content, I'm going more on the media side, but it seems like the sports content consumption is changing or evolving in ways. It seems like maybe less and less people are actively watching. I might be wrong, but watching full games or full length games, and there's different forms of content people enjoy or like to consume. I'm just curious, what's your thoughts on this? Do you see content consumption for sports changing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that at the end of the day, we continue to see advertisers really doubling down on being present in the sports broadcast, because at the end of the day, it's one of the sort of last bastions of live TV that people really tune into at any given time and engage with. And so I think we still do see a fair amount of the market really engaging with that sort of full end-to-end game. That being said, I think that there are lots of different ways that people can connect with the content. And I think that's why we've seen the growing pie in revenue around the sports media ecosystem. And so we think a lot about not only what are ways that you can create more engaging content for people who want to engage in a short form or just for the fourth quarter or whatever it might be, but also thinking about what are the sort of components of the sports ecosystem that weren't super well served by the traditional broadcast media ecosystem. So thinking about what are the niche sports that aren't getting the coverage that we think they can really provide to some deep niches of sports fans in ways that you can now that sort of digital content delivery really democratizes what content you can share with the world. I think it's both certainly some people wanting to tune in for shorter durations and thinking about how do you really sort of tell the story in those more compact viewpoints, but also thinking about what are the range of stories people want to see and hear about in the sports ecosystem and not just focus on the big four sports in the US as an example.
I think you're the best person to ask this question because looking at your portfolio, like you said, like I said before, you cover that entire end-to-end process of the actual sports teams, content. We talked earlier about an actual physical product or consumer brand, and then even in platforms that cover support sports, even content itself. I feel like looking at just the media industry in general, and this may have some overlap with sports content as well, but it feels like media or content is blending with consumer products or services. And sometimes it feels like media almost feels like a feature almost as opposed to the core product. I'm just curious, just to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's an astute point. I think as we think about consumer products brand and how you reach consumers in what is increasingly a very direct to consumer type model, I think you really do need to be great about telling your brand story and the sort of content that goes around that to really engage the consumer in an authentic way and make sure that they know who your brand is and why they should be choosing your products. Going back to the Tracksmith example, I think they do an excellent job of that, of creating audio content, print content, media campaigns that really demonstrate the brand ethos and say who they are and what they stand for. And I think it's really important and has helped them to build that community I was alluding to. And then I think on the other hand, there are also still really pure play media companies who are building really core brands with media really at the heart of it. Like we're investors in a company called Flow Sports that's all about streaming niche sports content to really deep consumer communities. And I think there it's really interesting because commerce has a really great opportunity to engage with that media ecosystem and really reach more focused groups of individuals and viewers. And so they have really interesting partnerships with a number of brands to really bring them this audience that's really passionate about cheerleading or mountain biking or dirt track racing, whatever it might be. And really those brands who want to be a part of those communities really showing up in those spaces that are authentic for them as well. So I think it's definitely true that consumer products need to think about what is the media strategy, and it can be owning it or it can be partnering. But I think these days you definitely have to have one.
It's interesting to see how you say that you can still see the best in both worlds. There is a blend, but there's also standalone products. Very interesting. I wanted to go back on the almost previous question. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but the media seems like it's a really challenging industry because it seems like it's constantly evolving both on just content formats, the method of distribution. And do you think there's going to be any new big ways in which we see users or consumers consume or distribute or interact with sports?
Yeah, one space that I'm watching a lot is how the audio ecosystem evolves. I think in the early days of sort of the sports ecosystem, really radio was this really transformative medium that allowed for great sports storytelling and for great sports communities to come together in very localized ways. I think that sort of sports audio dynamic is now consumers have a lot more opportunities in ways that they engage with sports focused audio content. And thinking about how does the rise of smart speakers drive the way people want to engage with audio content? How does the podcast landscape sort of start to steal share from the traditional radio space? And even sort of new platforms like Clubhouse and others that are really creating a new sort of live audio experience. I think we see just tons of transformation happening there. And in particular, as it becomes less and less likely that you have an AM, FM radio hanging around, you really have to take more ownership into what sort of audio sports content you're engaging with. And I think that's going to create some great opportunities for new storytelling in the sports ecosystem.
I wanted to jump into a separate topic and really discussing business models, more for on the media side, because it seems like business models for content is tough. It seems like it's still the traditional form of advertising, and that evolves depending on the platform and content distribution. But do you think business models or monetization strategies are evolving for sports media or sports content or even sports brands?
Yeah, I think there are just lots of new ways that one could monetize as a brand. And I think it's really important to think through all of the opportunities that a given company has on hand. We are very heavy investors in some of the movement over to subscription content models, and certainly feel like there's a really big opportunity to really tightly connect consumers paying for content that really gets them excited. And I think there's a lot of value to be had there, both in sort of video content, audio content, even gaming content. Certainly lots of proven models now. That's a really great monetization opportunity. But that being said, putting all content behind a paywall and having the subscription model as the one and only, I certainly don't think is right for the industry as well. And I think it'll be interesting to see if we've over-rotated a little bit on the subscription side of things, particularly just stepping back and thinking about content more generally. There's still a lot of advertisers that want to reach consumer eyeballs. And as people are increasingly spending time on Netflix and all of these new streaming services, there's increasingly less and less time being spent where advertisers can actually reach consumers. And so I think some of these ad-supported streaming platforms are going to be really successful because of that dynamic, because advertisers need a place to reach people. And ultimately, I think dollars will continue flowing there. And then lastly, I think that there's increasing opportunities around thinking about licensed products, or within the sports ecosystem, thinking about sports betting integration, lots of new channels that I think are starting to be proven out as sort of strong monetization avenues as well. And so I think as we talk to our portfolio companies, it's really about, here's the 10 or so different ways you could be thinking about monetizing. What are the trade-offs you're making by picking one or the other, and really making sure that there's some level of balance and not an over allocation to just one of those models.
It's really interesting to see and I like how you highlighted that there's a lot of opportunities in various formats to monetize, but at the same time, you still have advertisers that are still there and they still want to serve ads, and there's still there's a good opportunity. And also recognizing the subscription model is still a route, but also at the same time, you don't necessarily want to lose the discovery aspect, but you can still take advantage of the advertising model. There could be a blend. It's not the one solution that fits all for this type of content. So it's really interesting to see how you see how it spreads out. And I think it's a great insight. I have to ask though, because obviously we've lived through over a year of a pandemic, and it's been really shaken up a lot of industries. And I'm just curious, how do you think the pandemic has affected the sports industry and maybe even the startups that you work with?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think that the sports ecosystem has really been thinking about digital engagement for a long time, but a lot of times we saw brands know that's something that they need to be tuning into, but maybe not investing there just because there is so much around sort of the in-person experience or sort of these other avenues of reaching fans. And so I think 2020 and now into 2021 is seeing great investment around building sort of digital communities around your sports property and how you do that in an effective way. and how you want to really rethink what the broadcast experience looks like, and maybe make it a little less one-to-many and a little more one-to-one, a little more personalized. And I think we're finally seeing big media companies, big sports properties leaning in on that, where I think it really took the pandemic to accelerate some of those efforts. So I think that's going to be good news for the industry long term. The other thing we're watching a lot is certainly groups like the NFL and the NBA are really coming out of the pandemic still quite strong because of the amount of revenue that comes from media rights. But some smaller sports properties are certainly being hit a lot harder. I think the youth sports ecosystem is getting hit pretty hard. We definitely see some of our portfolio companies, for example, structuring deals to support those smaller leagues or properties that are really important for our sports community to still have around, but have really taken a big hit in the pandemic. And it's been fun to see the way some of our portfolio companies can engage there and help to protect some of these businesses, that we come out from this pandemic still with a really robust sports ecosystem wherever possible.
Jasmine, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to answer a lot of the questions I had, and it's really insightful. So I really appreciate it. I wanted to shift gears now from just general questions and just really highlight the unique aspects of your fund, because you guys, you mentioned at the very beginning, you're represented by a lot of individuals. Your team has, and yourself have an extensive background in the sports ecosystem. And I'm just curious, maybe you can elaborate more on the unique things that you offer to your portfolio companies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for us, whenever we invest, it's really important to make sure that there's a clear strategic value add that we're going to bring. I think that's the commitment that we've made to our limited partners as investors in our fund, and the commitment that we very much make to all of our portfolio companies up front as we're engaging. We really like to be thoughtful during the investment process, to have deep discussions around where can our network be helpful to you? What are some strategies you're trying to think through that maybe you want to understand what we've seen work or not work in the past. So really try to be thoughtful up front at the start of the investment process, and where are we going to focus our efforts together to collaborate with management teams. And then we typically engage at the board level with a lot of our portfolio companies. So we typically take board seats, and that really gives us the kind of visibility to be able to help provide thoughtful advice on how to navigate this ecosystem. I think that sports and media and gaming, some of these places we play, I think there's a lot of commonalities that can be shared across those businesses. And so the combined sort of decades of experience that we have as a team can hopefully inform our portfolio companies about mistakes that we've made or we've seen other people make, and how they can be even more effective. And then we love to bring in our limited partners and investors to collaborate with our portfolio companies as well. And they're a group who's great and excited to engage with the companies that we back, to become customers of them, to find great ways to partner. So that's really what gets us excited, is how do we bring new and innovative companies into this sort of deep ecosystem that we're a part of and love, and how do we sort of create a lot of value for everyone involved because of it.
Really awesome. Well, Jasmine, I think that was a great note to end on. Before I close out, did you have any other asks or things that you'd like to announce to the audience?
No, it was a real pleasure to have this conversation, and certainly any other folks who invest in this ecosystem or any founders who are looking for funding in this ecosystem, we always love to meet new people and find ways to work together. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Jasmine, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time. And again, for the audience, why we had this conversation, we looked at a handful of some impressive media venture investors, but one of the investors that really stood out to us was Causeway Media Partners, just because of your approach to specifically the sports ecosystem, but your portfolio that you've built out. It's really an end-to-end across the board, both content, both brands, both teams, both platforms that support the ecosystem. It's interesting to see that you come in as not only a later stage player, but you have a really interesting network that has decades of experience within the sports ecosystem in a variety of different verticals that can actually really support those companies to get to that next level of what they're looking for, especially at that stage a little bit later. And your portfolio speaks volume, your guys' background speaks volume. So it's fantastic to have you part of this event. So thank you so much again for taking the time.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.